Causes of the American Revolution. So what we're going to look at is a timeline of the causes of the American Revolution, right? So a lot of these things are topics you probably remember from middle school. So this is pretty basic American history stuff. So things like the Sugar Act, things like the Boston Tea Party, things like that. And so there's a date next to each of these events. The date you won't need to know for a test, but just gives you a sense of time, a sense of order. We're getting ready for the American Revolution, but first we have to see the causes. What causes it? That's what we're looking at today. Okay. And so once again, kind of to keep in mind, the proverbial dominoes are already starting to fall. And so we're going to look at kind of review three topics we've already kind of mentioned before, but we're going to kind of put them in their place. So we talked about the French and Indian War, we talked about Pontiac's Rebellion, we talked about the Proclamation of 1763, but we're going to review those quick and then we're going to move on. So the dominoes have already started to fall, and these dominoes are going to lead us to the American Revolution. So let's review three things first, and then we will look at some new stuff. So review thing number one is the French and Indian War. So remember, it's also called the 7 Years' War. This is going to end the era of salutary neglect. Remember, salutary neglect is when the mother country, England, let the United States, or let the American colonies, shall we say, do pretty much whatever they wanted. There was definitely taxes, there's definitely regulations in the books, but those were oftentimes ignored, right? They weren't enforced. And so remember, with the French and Indian War, there's been a lot of debt, and England's going to expect the American colonies to help pay off that debt, and so they're going to start to enforce taxes. And so once again, the French and Indian War is the end of salutary neglect. We're going to see England enforce taxes. Okay, so that was review. And so this is just a fun way to remember it, because of course the French and Indian War is what officially begins Era 3. So Era 3 goes from 1754 to 1800. And 1754 is the date that the French and Indian War started. So this is how I remember it. The French and Indians started a war in 1754. That's very exciting. Always remember, never forget. Okay. So Pontiac's Rebellion is a result of the French losing the French and Indian War. And so Pontiac, as we mentioned before, he is a Native American, and he is not in a wonderful position because remember, a lot of Native Americans had sided with the French during the French and Indian War. And so once the French lose, the Native Americans are really in a tough spot, because what's going to happen, or I should say in Pontiac's Rebellion, what's going to happen, is Pontiac is more or less going to start going around and attacking all of these British settlements. They're trying to prevent encroachment on their land, and Pontiac thinks the best way to do that is to attack the settlers there. And so this is in response to the French and Indian War. They don't want British settlers coming into this Ohio River Valley, so they're going to attack them. So this is a little bit of a review, right? Praise the Lord. Okay, and then finally we have, as reviews, the Proclamation of 1763. The whole idea here is the British are so overspending money on the American colonies, and so they draw this proclamation line more or less at the Appalachian Mountains and say all of the colonists that you cannot go west of this line. And so the Proclamation of 1763 is preventing the colonists from moving west. Okay, so these are all things we've talked about before, but we just have to put them in their proper lineup. Now we get to the good stuff. Now we get to the new stuff. New stuff number one is the Sugar Act. So the Sugar Act is the first parliamentary act that's really bent on creating a revenue, right? So this is an act that is not about regulation. This is an act about money. And so this is the first one. So I have the little sugar cookies with the number 1 to help you remember the Sugar Act was the first kind of new tax, if you will. And when I'm saying new tax, it's actually not a new tax. This was on the books before. I think we talked about it when we were talking about mercantilism, like there was a Molasses Act already in place. But what was happening is that original act was going to expire, and so they revamped it and they made it very clear that they were going to enforce this. So it's kind of ironic, but the actual tax went down. So before it was like 6 pence per gallon as a tax, but now is 3 pence per gallon, but we're actually going to enforce it this time. So it's a tax on sugar coming from the West Indies. Like I said, it's 3 pence per gallon. It's a cheaper tax than what was on the books originally. But once again, this is going to be enforced. They're not going to be joking around. The colonists, how they respond to the Sugar Act, there's not a huge response. There's kind of some mild grumbling, but there's really no organized response to this. So we'll see like the Stamp Act, everyone loses their mind over the Stamp Act, but the Sugar Act, it's the first new tax, if you will, and they're going to enforce it, but there's really not a lot of organization on the colony side to resist it. Okay. Next, we have the Quartering Act. And so the Quartering Act required the colonies to house British soldiers. So the colonies were responsible for like housing and, I believe, feeding the British soldiers. And so at first, typically what they would do is they'd build barracks. So if the barracks got too full, then they would put the soldiers in like hotels, if you will, or other public housing. And then if that wasn't available or too full, then they would take over homes. And typically they would try to get homes that didn't have people living in them in the first place. And so it really wasn't the case that they would go into private homes and force the family to live with a whole group of British soldiers. That really wasn't the case. It was, though, super expensive. And so specifically the state of New York is the state's going to get really salty about the Quartering Act because they don't want to pay the expense of having to house these soldiers. So just to be clear, typically the Quartering Act isn't necessarily forcing soldiers into your home. That's not really what this is about. Maybe it happened once in a while, but it's more that they have to pay for it. So like I said, they'd try to do barracks first. No barracks, then they do like hotels. If no hotels, then they would take over houses where there was no one living there in the first place. So just so you know. And like I said, New York State was really salty about it because they didn't like footing the bill for the British soldiers. Okay. Admiralty courts. Okay, so these are courts that were trying smugglers. Because remember, Britain's like, we're not joking around. Salutary neglect is gone. And so like the Sugar Act, for example, they need to enforce it. And one of the mechanisms for enforcing it was the Admiralty courts. And so on these courts, there was only a judge, right? There's no jury. And these were set up specifically to try smugglers. And so you were assumed guilty until proven innocent, right? So you had to prove to the court, to the judge, that you were innocent. You were assumed guilty first. And really, like I said, this is a huge point of contention for the colonists. They think these Admiralty courts are super unfair, and plus these are the ways that the smugglers are actually being prosecuted, so they didn't like them either. So these are prosecuting smugglers, especially thinking of anyone who is violating those navigation acts. No judges, or I should say only judges, no juries. You're assumed guilty until proven innocent. And the colonists do not like this at all. They're like, this is so unfair. This is so unfair. Let's move on. Oh, the Stamp Act. So you can see over here, this guy is losing his mind. He's like, no, we're not gonna. So the Stamp Act is a big deal. Can I say that again? It's a big deal. The colonists frickin' lose their minds over the Stamp Act. Okay, so what was it? It's a tax. It's a tax on things like cards, newspapers, licenses. There was about 50 items total that had this stamp that you would have to pay for. And so it's named Stamp Act because, like I said, there's a stamp. So there's about 50 items and you would have to pay this extra tax to get a stamp on it. And the colonists, like I said, really freaked out. It was the most odious or the most hated of these new taxes. With that, this tax is actually fairly common. This tax was a tax that was in England. But like I said, this is when we first start to hear the phrase, no taxation without representation. The Sugar Act, no one really reacted to too strongly. The Stamp Act, they're definitely going to be reacting very strongly. And it's a tax on cards, newspapers, licenses, paper goods. Like there are 50 items total. But there is going to be a huge reaction in the American colonies because of it. One of the ways that the colonists reacted to the Stamp Act is through this new group, the Sons and Daughters of Liberty. So the Sons and Daughters of Liberty were really formed in response to the Stamp Act. They really hated it. And it's like a secret society. And they're trying to undermine British rule, right? They hate British rule. They're doing whatever they can to undermine it, right? They're meeting and they're saying the Stamp Act is stupid. Besides saying the Stamp Act is stupid, what they would do is they'd ransack homes of unpopular officials. And so they go and like make your house a nightmare. They would, it was so bad, in fact, that when the Stamp Act actually took effect, because remember, it was like proclaimed and then eventually it took effect. In that time, there was literally no one left to collect the taxes because all of the tax agents resigned because they were scared that their home would be attacked by the Sons and Daughters of Liberty. And so it was definitely like a violent group in that regard. So here's some facts about the Sons and Daughters of Liberty. So there are really kind of the two main chapters. The first one is Boston. Boston would always meet under the Liberty Tree. That's fun in Boston. So they're under the Liberty Tree here. In New York, then, they'd meet under what's called the Liberty Pole. That's also very exciting. And so they would organize their meetings, oftentimes having these meetings in taverns. Okay. Who's the leader? Let me go here. Sam Adams is the leader, and Sam Adams is fun. There's, of course, a beer called Sam Adams. Fun fact, this guy who's pictured here is actually, that's a picture of Paul Revere. They didn't think that Sam Adams would have looked as good on the label, and so poor Sam Adams, his picture's not even on his own beer. That's Paul Revere. So Sam Adams, just in case you don't know, you ought to get to know him. He is going to be a huge figure in the beginning of the American Revolution. And he's actually second cousins with John Adams. Of course, you'll remember from middle school that John Adams will become president of the United States. His second cousin, John Adams, will become, like I said, second president of the United States. And so, John Adams, Sam Adams, they're second cousins, which I think just means like they had one of their grandparents are the same. Okay. So he is going to be the leader of the Sons and Daughters of Liberty. And like I said, they are really a motley crew. And so tavern mongers, wharf rats, and other seedy characters made up the Sons and Daughters of Liberty. So you wouldn't necessarily, people who had a high rank in society wouldn't necessarily find themselves amongst the Sons and Daughters of Liberty. They're kind of like gangsters. So there you go. You can choose real life or you can choose the gangster life. Okay. Other things they would do, like I said, they would have boycotts. They would say, we're boycotting tea, whatever it might be. And then if you break the boycott, you would be in trouble. The Sons and Daughters of Liberty might come at you. And so, they'd enforce boycotts through tar and feathering people, because obviously you don't want to be that person. Other things they would do is they would hang people in effigy. And so we're just going to introduce you to what this term means, because this is like a very popular protest in colonial America. And so what they would do is they'd make like a doll of you. So if they really hated you, say you're enforcing a tax and they don't like it, they'd make like a little doll of you, and then they would hang it oftentimes, then people would beat it, or they would burn it. So it's a form of protest, okay? So they're very much kind of like the more violent side of the American Revolution. Praise the Lord. That's fun. Let's move on. Okay, so there's a lot of protest regarding the Stamp Act. And so eventually what happens is this. It's repealed. Praise the Lord. It's repealed. And so Britain's like, okay, we're willing to repeal the Stamp Act, which they do. But at the same time that they repeal the Stamp Act, they pass something called the Declaratory Act. So like they're declaring something, the Declaratory Act. And this Declaratory Act is declaring that, yes, we're repealing the Stamp Act, but we're still the boss. We still have the power to tax the colonies, and we have absolute power over colonial legislations. And so it's just reminding the colonies that, yes, you're getting your way right now, but keep in mind, we're still the boss. We can tax you. We have absolute control over all of these little legislations that you've created. So House of Burgesses, we're the boss. General Court, we're the boss, right? So it's just kind of saying, okay, you get your way this time, but don't forget who's in charge. All right. Next, we have a new set of taxes, the Townshend Act. And this is going to be taxes on things like tea, lead, paper, paint. So those are the four I typically hear. Tea, lead, paper, paint, I guess glass as well. So it's kind of a little hodgepodge of items. So let's make the list conclusive. Paper, lead, tea, paint, glass. Final answer, okay? And so, okay, why are they called the Townshend Acts? Well, let me tell you why. So this is a powder of the Townshend Acts. It comes from Champagne Charlie Townshend. So this guy he lives in England. And they called him Champagne Charlie. Wow, Champagne Charlie, because he would often be drunk at Parliament. He'd often give these really loud, obnoxious speeches to Parliament when he was super drunk. But he was saying, you know what, I got this great idea, right? We need money, and the colonists don't like taxes. So why don't we make an indirect tax? If we make the tax indirect, no one will notice, no one will care. So, what is an indirect tax? An indirect tax is like a customs tax. And so the tax is paid right away before the goods leave the ship. So say you're bringing over a bunch of, I don't know, barley. I don't know why you're importing barley, but congratulations, you're importing barley. And so what happened is that you would pay the customs tax or this indirect tax before the barley were to leave the ship. Right? As opposed to a direct tax, which would be more like a sales tax, where when you're buying your barley in the store, you're paying a tax up front right then. So they're saying, well, if it's an indirect tax, it's a customs tax, no one will see it, they won't care. Okay? And guess what? People did notice and people did care. And so one of the particularly notorious things with the Townshend Acts as well is where this money was going to be spent. And so the money, this tax from all of this lovely, paint, glass, tea, that tax was earmarked to pay the salaries of judges. And people aren't loving these judges, #admiralty courts, people hate them. And so this is specifically notorious because these taxes are going to pay the salaries of these judges. Okay. What else did I want to say with this? Okay, so a couple of things with this as well. One thing is just realize over time a lot of this stuff will actually be repealed slowly. So there wasn't kind of a one foul swoop where everything was overturned, but a lot of them will be overturned or repealed except for the tax on tea, which will become problematic later on. All right. Last thing with the Townshend Acts is after the Townshend Acts are passed, we're going to see 2 regiments of British troops sent to Boston to enforce it. Because remember, Boston is really kind of the epicenter of a lot of the rebellion in the United States or in the American colonies. And so after these acts are passed, they're going to send 2 regiments of troops to Boston to make sure they are enforced. Final answer. All right, let's move on. All right, Boston Massacre. So remember, after the Townshend Acts, these 2 regiments of troops are sent into Boston. And so it was about 2,000 troops. So when I'm saying troops, I'm saying soldiers, okay? So at the time-ish, there's about 16,000 civilians in Boston and about 2,000 now, of course, redcoats, 2,000 British soldiers. And there's a lot of tension in Boston between these redcoats and the citizens. One thing that had happened that's going to lead us up to the Boston Massacre is about 10 days before the massacre happens, there was an 11-year-old boy who had been shot, I think on accident, but nonetheless he was shot by a British soldier. And so after this 11-year-old boy was killed, tensions are at an all-time high. Okay, so this is going to happen in early March of 1770. So it was still really cold in Boston. There's still snow on the ground. And what's happening is there are some British soldiers who are guarding a customs house. So a customs house is like a house where all of the tax money was. And so they're guarding the king's money, right? They're guarding this custom house. And this angry mob shows up and they start to yell at the soldiers. They start to throw rocks. They start to throw snowballs. And so it's just kind of considered the most violent snowball fight ever. And so what's happening is the soldiers are kind of freaked out, like there's an angry mob shouting and throwing things at them. And so what happens is the soldiers open fire on the crowd. And so there's about 60 people there when the soldiers open fire. And in a result, 6 were injured and 5 were killed. So 5 colonists were killed, 6 colonists were injured. With that, there is a very famous kind of martyr in this group. Oh, by the way, like I said, there's like always a dog in pictures from colonial America. So like here's like all of this horrible bloodshed, and Paul Revere, who actually engraved this image, decided to throw a dog in there. Like, okay, like I just tell you what. Anyway, more on Paul Revere later. So one thing you do need to know about the Boston Massacre is this guy right here. So Crispus Attucks is known kind of as one of the first martyrs of the American Revolution, meaning he gave his faith for the attack. I'm going to give you some details about him. You don't necessarily need to know these for your test. You would know that Crispus Attucks was a mixed race person who was one of the leaders of the Boston Massacre, meaning he's one of the colonists who are protesting, who are unhappy with the way they're being treated by the British soldiers. And like I said, he's kind of considered one of the first martyrs for the cause. Okay, so here's some more details besides that. But he was actually, like I said, mixed race. So he was American Indian and also African American. He was a sailor, he's a rope maker, and the idea is it's kind of like we're connecting him to stuff you maybe already heard about, which I think is exciting. He was born in one of those praying towns. So remember, praying Indians that became Christian, lived in these little praying towns. So he was actually born in one of the praying towns, and his mom was a Wampanoag. And so all of these things we've heard before, so I think it's kind of fun. So like I said, this is kind of just for fun. He was a slave for the first 27 years of his life. But when he was 27, he ran away and he got his freedom. And he was really upset because there was a lot of competition for jobs. So FYI, the British Army did not pay their soldiers very much. And so a lot of these soldiers in Boston had to get part-time jobs on their free days or during their time off, or because they didn't have enough money to really live on. And so there's a lot of competitions over jobs in Boston because these soldiers are kind of picking up some extra hours, whatever, and it was causing the price of work to go down. So people were making less because there's so many people willing to work. Anyway, and so he is one of the 5 that die. And Sam Adams organizes this huge procession for him. During his funeral, or right before his funeral, somewhere between 10,000 to 12,000, about half the people in Boston show up for his procession. And he's laid in state for 3 days before his burial. So Crispus Attucks, what do you need to know? He's one of the 5 that were killed in the Boston Massacre, and he is kind of their symbolic leader, if you will, and he is really known as kind of one of the first martyrs for the American Revolution. Excellent. Yay. Okay, moving on. Committees of correspondence. Ah, look, there's other dogs. There's always dogs. Okay, committees of correspondence. They start by Sam Adams. Sam Adams created the first one, Samuel Adams, the first one in Boston. And its goal is to spread propaganda and secret information by way of letters. So it starts in Boston, but eventually over a few years, it's going to be very successful. Each colony is going to have their own committees of correspondence, and it's a way to link up the colonies, like I said. And this is definitely people who want to resist British control or British rule. Like I said, it's extremely effective. Like within a few years after Sam Adams started the first one in Boston, these are all over the American colonies. So kind of like Twitter, keeping everyone informed as to what is happening. Thanks, Sam Adams. That was a great idea. Okay, the Tea Act. Ooh, the Tea Act. Ooh, we've talked about tea a lot. So we're going to spill the tea on the Tea Act. Okay, what is it? Tea Act is a tax on tea. All right, but let's remind ourselves of something. Remember the Townshend Acts? A part of the Townshend Acts was a tax on tea. So there has been a tax on tea for a long time, okay? So this isn't like a brand new thing. But once again, they're going to enforce it. The idea here is it actually made tea less expensive, but the whole thing is principle over price. We know this Tea Act is actually making the original, okay, so the Townshend Acts had a Tea Act in it, all right? So this new Tea Act is actually lowering the price of tea, right? But the catch is that you could only buy your tea from Britain. That is the part that's really bothering people. So the whole idea is principle over price. It's not the price. Yes, we understand tea is going to be cheaper, but it's the principle. No taxation without representation, right? And so the part of the Tea Act people really didn't like is that you were forced to buy your tea from the British East India Company. And so they didn't like that they had to buy their tea from the British East India Company. What if they wanted to buy their tea from, I don't know, the French or something? And so it was all about principle under price. And plus they felt that it was really cutting into some of the smugglers or colonial merchants who made some money through smuggling. It's going to make smuggling a lot harder as well. Okay. And so, like I said, it's principle over price. It's not that the tax is this huge amount of money. It's that they're forcing the colonists to only buy tea from the British East India Company specifically. Okay, praise the Lord. Let's move on. Okay, so that brings us to the Boston Tea Party. So here is Boston Harbor over here, and as you can understand, Boston made most of its money through shipping, and so its harbor is where it makes its money. Okay. And so, like I said, the colonists are really upset about about the Tea Act. And so they create this giant boycott against the tea. But the thing is, there's a lot of tea being still shipped in. And so what they do is they refuse to let the merchants unload the tea. They're saying, absolutely not. We're not going to let you unload this tea. We're boycotting the tea. Stay on the ship, tea. And so what happens is this. The governor of Massachusetts orders the tea ships not to leave the harbor until the cargo was unloaded. And so this becomes kind of like one against the other thing, meaning like no one's backing down. So the colonists are saying, we're refusing to allow this to be unloaded. The governor of Massachusetts is saying, hey, people on this ship, you can't leave until you unload the cargo. And so they're kind of at a standstill, okay? By the way, there was boycotts against tea kind of up and down of colonial America. It just depended on the place you were. In one area, they literally just burned down the ship that was carrying the tea. Another area is they confiscated the tea and then later sold the tea and used the revenue for funding the American Revolution. And other places, they just told the ship to leave and the ship left. And so a lot of different ports across the United States reacted to this in different ways. But Boston is Boston, and Boston, people don't mess around, okay? Sam Adams is there, you don't mess around. And so they're at a standstill. The governor is saying, you can't leave until the tea's unloaded. and they're like, we're not going to allow you to unload the tea. So what does one do? So this is created by the Sons and Daughters of Liberty. They're the ones who are in charge of it. So the Sons and Daughters of Liberty. And so what they do, and this is in December 16th, in case you're wondering, is the colonists disguise themselves as Mohawk Indians. Remember, the Mohawk are part of the Iroquois tribe. And so they disguise themselves as Mohawk Indians. They board the ships and throw 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor. Dang. 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor. That would be, in today's money, about $1 million worth of tea. So they throw $1 million-ish amount of tea into Boston Harbor. Okay, and so there's going to definitely be some repercussions for this, but this is what the Tea Party is that's what the Boston Tea Party is. Let's move on. Okay, oh, there they are. They're dressed as Mohawk Indians in the middle of the night. They go aboard the ships and they throw the tea into Boston Harbor. Okay, so this is the response of the Boston Tea Party, and these are called the coercive acts, or sometimes they're called the intolerable acts. I usually call them intolerable acts because I'm really bad at saying the word coercive. But just if whatever on a test you see coercive acts or intolerable acts, they mean the same thing. Same thing, different name. Okay, so this is in response to the Boston Tea Party, and this is what the intolerable acts include. 1, they're going to close Boston Harbor until damages are paid. Remember, it's about $1 million worth of tea, and so they're going to close down the harbor, which is horrible for Boston, because that's how Boston makes their money, through shipping. And so they have to pay damages before Boston Harbor could reopen. They're going to restrict town meetings in Massachusetts, so no more town meetings for you. They made British officials immune to criminal prosecution in Massachusetts. They believed that soldiers or British officials weren't going to get a fair trial in the colonies, and so it made them immune to criminal prosecution in Massachusetts. And then there's a new quartering act, and this one is perhaps the one you think of more often when you're thinking of the quartering act. But this is going to allow soldiers to live anywhere, even in private homes. So the first quartering act, it wasn't very common for soldiers to end up in private homes, but this new one, soldiers would absolutely be living in private homes. And so this is punishment on Boston and kind of Massachusetts in general for the Tea Party. All right, so the colonists aren't going to take this lying down, and this brings us to, of course, the First Continental Congress. Woo! Okay. So this is a meeting of delegates from 12 out of the 13 colonies, and they're meeting in Philadelphia to kind of respond to the intolerable acts. And just so you can kind of see a map here, so Philadelphia, this is where our government is going to be during the American Revolution. And then, of course, New York City, Boston, D.C., just so you can kind of see where it is. So 12 out of the 13 colonies meet together in Philadelphia to discuss and to respond to what are we going to do about these intolerable acts. And they petitioned King George III. They're saying, we're not happy about this. Like, this is not okay with us. Right? And at the same time, the First Continental Congress calls for a complete boycott of all of the goods. So completely boycotting everything, not just tea. Okay. So what does King George III say? Well, actually, King George III, he's a king. He's not the prime minister. So once again, kind of keep in mind, in Britain, of course, the king is the king, but the prime minister is the person who deals with the day-to-day kind of running of the country. And so might as well get to know this guy's name because we'll be talking about him more when we talk about like battles and stuff of the American Revolution. But prime minister at the time is George Grenville. Grenville? That's how I'm going to say it. And his response is this idea of virtual representation. Remember, the colonists' battle cry is no taxation without representation, right? We don't have a representative in Parliament, ergo, we shouldn't be taxed by Parliament because we're not represented there. Well, George says this, okay, the idea that you absolutely have to know is something called virtual representation. He's saying, yes, you are represented. Every member of Parliament represents every British citizen, not just those in their district. And so while they're complaining that, no taxation without representation, the Prime Minister is answering this with the idea of virtual representation. Well, no, you are represented. Every member of Parliament represents every British citizen, including you. Okay. So that concludes what we're going to talk about for today. We're going to look at some more violence breaking out here later on. And so we're going to still see Lexington and Concord and the Olive Branch Petition and the Declaration of Independence. All of that is still to come. But we did have to have a little bit of this is the tension is building. The tension is building. It hasn't yet exploded into straight up violence, but it is building. And so here you go. Is that my phone? To be continued. That's what I want to say to you, to be continued. All right, so let's just kind of summarize this. So once again, we're looking at causes of the American Revolution, and it really is dominoes. One thing leads to the next, to the next, to the next, and we're building up tension, and pretty soon we're going to see the first shots fired at Lexington and Concord, but this is the background stuff. All right, so to be continued, we're going to fight a revolution, but you just have to wait for it a little bit.